Harlem in the early 1930s did not sleep the way other places did. It breathed, it watched, it remembered, and if you stood still long enough beneath its dim street lamps, you could almost feel the weight of stories pressing against your chest. Stories of pride and pain tangled together so tightly that no one could separate them anymore. And on one such night, when the city hummed low and restless, a quiet figure stepped out of the shadows with the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet commanded it completely. Bumpy Johnson, a man whose reputation traveled faster than his footsteps, but whose true power lived not in fear, but in the discipline of knowing exactly when to speak and when to remain still. The air carried a tension that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with something far more fragile: dignity. Because in Harlem, dignity was currency, and it was constantly under threat from forces that did not understand its value. And that evening, whispers moved like currents through barbershops, cafes, and brownstone stoops about an incident that no one could quite explain without lowering their voice, as if even the truth itself had become dangerous. And at the center of it all was a young woman named Lila Mae Carter, whose name until that week had meant nothing beyond her small circle of neighbors, but now carried the uneasy weight of something unresolved. Lila Mae had been seen entering the Grand Lenox Ballroom 2 nights prior, a place known for its music, its elegance, and the illusion that, within its walls, respect could briefly outshine the harshness waiting outside. But illusions have a way of breaking at the worst possible moment. And by the end of that night, she had been dragged out in silence, her voice dismissed before it could even form, her presence reduced to a disturbance rather than a person. And those who witnessed it had done what people often do when fear outweighs courage. They looked away just long enough to convince themselves they hadn't seen anything at all. Bumpy had not been there that night, but absence had never stopped him from understanding the truth. Because truth, in Harlem, did not rely on official reports or polished statements. It lived in the pauses between words, in the way people avoided eye contact, in the sudden quiet that followed certain names being spoken. And as he sat in a modest corner of a cafe the following evening, his gaze steady and unreadable, he listened. As the pieces came together, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned long ago that the loudest lies are often built on the smallest silences. "They say she caused trouble," someone muttered, stirring their coffee without drinking it. "They say a lot of things," another replied, voice low, careful. But what no one said outright lingered heavier than anything spoken: that the girl had tried to speak, had tried to explain, and had been shut down not because she was wrong, but because acknowledging her would have required someone in that room to choose truth over convenience. And convenience, as it so often did, had won. Across the room, Bumpy's fingers rested lightly against the table, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. Yet there was a stillness about him that suggested something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. Because he understood the pattern all too well: the dismissal, the quiet erasure, the rewriting of events until the victim became the problem and the problem disappeared entirely. And what unsettled him was not just what had happened to Lila Mae, but how quickly it had been buried. It would have ended there, like so many other stories, if not for what happened the next morning, when Lila Mae was seen again, walking unsteadily down 135th Street, her coat wrapped tightly around her despite the mild weather, her eyes fixed ahead as though looking anywhere else might cause her to fall apart. And it was then that Mrs. Ellington, a woman whose years had taught her the difference between trouble and injustice, noticed something that made her stop mid-step: the faint, uneven discoloration along Lila Mae's neck, marks that did not belong to accident or imagination. Marks that told a story no one had yet dared to speak aloud. By the time word reached Bumpy, it was no longer just a rumor, it was a quiet certainty, one that carried consequences, because Harlem could tolerate many things, but it did not easily forgive cruelty disguised as authority. And as the sun dipped low once more, casting long shadows across the streets, Bumpy rose from his seat, adjusting his coat with the same measured precision he applied to everything in his life, and stepped out into the evening with a purpose that did not need to be announced. The Grand Lenox Ballroom stood as it always had, its lights bright, its music inviting, its facade untouched by the events it had chosen not to acknowledge, and as Bumpy approached, there was no urgency in his stride, no visible anger, only a quiet determination that made those who recognized him straighten slightly, unsure whether to step forward or step aside. Because Bumpy Johnson did not arrive anywhere without reason, and when he did, it was rarely insignificant. Inside, the atmosphere was carefully maintained, laughter echoing just a little too loudly, conversations flowing just a little too smoothly, as if everyone present had collectively agreed to pretend that nothing had happened, and for a moment, it almost worked, until Bumpy moved through the room with effortless calm, his presence creating a subtle shift that no one could quite explain, like a change in the air pressure before a storm. He did not head for the center of the room, did not call for attention, did not demand answers, because he understood something the others did not, that truth, when approached correctly, reveals itself without force, and instead he made his way to the edge of the ballroom, where a man in a pressed suit stood overseeing the evening with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to control. A man whose smile faltered ever so slightly when Bumpy stopped beside him. "Evening," Bumpy said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Mr. Johnson," the man replied, recovering quickly, though the tension in his posture betrayed him. "To what do we owe the visit?" Bumpy's gaze moved briefly across the room before returning, steady and unhurried. "I hear there was a misunderstanding here a couple nights ago." The word misunderstanding hung in the air, heavy with implication, and for a brief moment, the man hesitated, caught between denial and deflection, before settling on the safer option. "Nothing of importance. A minor disturbance. It's been handled." "Handled," Bumpy repeated softly, as if considering the word, weighing it. For truth, before nodding once, slowly. "I see." There was no accusation, no raised voice, yet something in the exchange unsettled the man far more than anger would have, because anger could be dismissed, challenged, controlled. But this quiet, measured presence left no clear path for resistance. And as the music continued to play, the illusion of normalcy began to fracture in ways no one could quite articulate. Outside, Harlem watched, as it always did, sensing that something was shifting, something that would not be easily undone, and though no one yet knew exactly what would come next, there was an understanding, unspoken but shared, that Bumpy Johnson had not come for answers, he had come for truth, and truth, once pursued by a man like him, had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it had been buried. And as the night stretched on, carrying with it the quiet tension of something unresolved, one thing became certain in the hearts of those paying close enough attention. This was only the beginning, and whatever had been hidden would not remain. So for long, the night after Bumpy Johnson stepped into the Grand Lenox Ballroom did not end when the music faded or when the doors closed. It lingered, stretched thin across Harlem like a question no one could answer out loud, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And even those who had convinced themselves the matter was settled began to feel the quiet pressure of truth pressing against the fragile walls they had built to contain it. While Bumpy, as always, did not rush, did not react impulsively, but instead allowed the silence to do what it was meant to do, unsettle the comfortable and steady the patient dot by morning. The story had changed again, as it often did when those in control realized they were losing their grip, and now the whispers carried a sharper edge, claiming that Lila Mae Carter had fabricated the entire incident, that she had been emotional, confused, words carefully chosen not just to dismiss her, but to diminish her, because it was easier to erase a person than to confront the truth they carried. And yet, for every voice that repeated the official version, there were two more that hesitated, that remembered the look in her eyes, the unsteady way she walked, the marks that could not be explained away no matter how polished the lie became. Bumpy heard all of it, not in one place, not in one conversation, but in fragments gathered from the rhythm of the streets, from men who spoke in half-sentences, and women who lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. And he understood something that others did not, that the louder the denial became, the closer it was to breaking, because truth does not grow weaker under pressure. It sharpens. It was late afternoon when Bumpy sent for Dutch Schultz, not as a summons, but as an invitation, the kind that carried weight precisely because it was not forced. And when Dutch arrived, stepping into the quiet office where sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, he carried himself with that same composed dignity that had marked him the night before, yet there was something different now, something more deliberate in his gaze, as though he had spent the intervening hours considering not just what had happened, but what it meant. "You've stirred something," Dutch said, removing his gloves with slow precision, his tone even but thoughtful. Bumpy remained seated, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. It was already there. Dutch nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without argument. And now? Bumpy's fingers traced the edge of the desk, a small, almost absent gesture that masked the depth of his focus. Now we let it come to the surface. There was no elaborate plan laid out, no grand declaration, because Bumpy did not believe in forcing outcomes. He believed in creating conditions where the truth could no longer be ignored. And as the hours passed, those conditions began to take shape in ways both subtle and undeniable, as more people came forward not to accuse, but to confirm, to share what they had seen in quiet, careful words that built upon one another until the weight of collective memory became impossible to dismiss. Yet even as the truth gathered strength, those who had something to lose moved quickly to protect themselves, and by evening, a new announcement circulated through Harlem, carried by officials whose confidence seemed just a little too rehearsed, declaring that a formal statement would be made at the Grand Lenox Ballroom the following night, an official clarification meant to settle the matter once and for all. And though it was presented as resolution, it felt more like a final attempt to control the narrative before it slipped entirely beyond their reach. Bumpy received the news without reaction, as he so often did. But those who knew him understood that his stillness was not indifference, it was calculation, the kind that required patience rather than haste. And as he stepped out onto the street that evening, Harlem seemed to move around him with a heightened awareness, as if the entire neighborhood understood that whatever would happen next would not simply pass like the events before it. The night of the announcement arrived with an almost unnatural clarity, the sky stretching wide and dark above the glowing lights of the ballroom, where a crowd gathered not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, something that had been building since the moment Lila Mae Carter had been silenced. And inside, the atmosphere carried a tension so thick it seemed to press against every conversation, every glance, every breath. Dutch Schultz stood near the back, his presence understated yet unmistakable, watching with a focus that suggested he was no longer simply an observer, while Bumpy entered without fanfare, moving through the room with the same quiet authority that had begun to unsettle those who relied on noise and distraction to maintain control. And as he took his place along the side, he did not look toward the stage, did not acknowledge the officials preparing to speak. He looked at the people, at their faces, their hesitation, their expectation, because he understood that the truth did not belong to those at the front of the room. It belonged to those who had witnessed it. The announcement began as expected, with carefully measured words and practiced concern, a narrative constructed to sound reasonable, to smooth over inconsistencies and present a version of events that could be accepted without too much scrutiny. And for a moment, it almost worked, the familiarity of authority offering a kind of comfort to those who preferred certainty over confrontation, until a shift occurred so subtle it was almost imperceptible at first. It began with a single voice, quiet but steady, Not raised in anger, but grounded in something far more difficult to dismiss: conviction. And then another followed, and another, each adding a piece to the truth that had been denied, not in chaos, not in disorder, but in a growing clarity that spread through the room like light breaking through shadow, until the carefully constructed narrative began to falter under the weight of what could no longer be contained. Through it all, Bumpy remained still, his presence anchoring the moment without overtly directing it, because this was not about him. It was about allowing the truth to stand on its own. And as the voices grew stronger, more certain, the officials on stage found themselves facing something they could not control, something that did not respond to authority or intimidation, the quiet, undeniable force of collective truth. And then, at the precise moment when the tension reached its peak, when the room stood balanced between denial and acceptance, Bumpy stepped forward, not with urgency, not with force, but with a calm that cut through the noise like a steady hand. And when he spoke, it was not to argue, not to accuse, but simply to ask that Layla Mae Carter be brought forward once more, not as a subject of speculation, but as a person whose voice deserved to be heard. The request hung in the air, simple yet unyielding, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because in that quiet, it became clear that this was no longer a matter of control. It was a matter of choice. And the room, filled with witnesses and truth alike, waited for that choice to be made. And as the seconds stretched, heavy with consequence, one thing became unmistakably clear: whatever happened next would not just define the night, but would echo far beyond it. Because dignity, once challenged, does not simply fade away. It demands to be seen, to be acknowledged, and ultimately to be restored. The moment Bumpy Johnson asked for Layla Mae Carter to be brought forward did not explode into chaos as some might have expected. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, a silence so complete it seemed to pull the air from the room, because everyone present understood, whether they admitted it or not, that what was about to happen would not simply resolve a dispute. It would reveal something far deeper about who they were willing to be when truth stood directly in front of them. No one moved at first, not the officials on stage, not the men stationed at the doors, not even the musicians who had long since stopped playing, their instruments resting idle as if they too were waiting for permission to breathe again. And in that stillness, Bumpy remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. Because he had not come to force the moment, he had come to make it unavoidable. Dutch Schultz, standing near the back, shifted slightly, not in impatience but in recognition, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the quiet understanding of a man who had spent years navigating power yet was now witnessing a different kind. Altogether, one that did not rely on dominance or fear, but on something far more difficult to command: respect. And for perhaps the first time, he found himself not calculating advantage, but observing integrity. Finally, a murmur passed through the edges of the room, hesitant at first, then growing just enough to break the paralysis, and from a side corridor, Layla Mae appeared, not escorted in the way one might expect, but guided gently by Mrs. Ellington, whose steady presence carried the quiet strength of someone who had lived long enough to know when silence becomes a form of harm. And as they stepped into the open space, every eye turned not out of curiosity now, but out of something heavier, something closer to accountability. Layla Mae did not look the same as she had days before, not because she had weakened, but because she had endured, and endurance leaves its mark in ways both visible and unseen. Yet there was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, despite everything, that spoke of a dignity that had not been broken, only tested. And as she stood there, the faint marks along her neck no longer hidden beneath fabric or shadow, the truth that had been dismissed began to take shape in a way that could no longer be ignored. The officials exchanged glances, their confidence unraveling in small telling ways, the polished certainty of their earlier statements now replaced by a discomfort they could not conceal. And one of them stepped forward, clearing his throat, as if to regain control, his voice measured but strained as he attempted to redirect the moment, to frame it once again as misunderstanding, as confusion, as anything other than what it so clearly was. But Bumpy did not interrupt him, did not challenge him directly, because he understood that the man's words were no longer the center of the room. The truth was, and it did not require argument to stand, and so, when the official finished, his explanation hanging thinly in the air, Bumpy simply stepped closer to Lila May, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of the moment. He did not ask her to speak immediately, did not place the burden on her to prove what should never have been questioned, because he knew that dignity is not restored by demanding strength from the wounded. It is restored by removing the need for them to defend their own truth, and so instead, he turned slightly, addressing the room with a calm that carried farther than any raised voice could. "Some things," he said quietly, his tone steady, "don't need explanation. They need acknowledgement." The words settled over the crowd, simple yet undeniable, and then, without dramatics, without flourish, he reached out not forcefully, not invasively, but with a careful respect, and gently touched the side of Lila May's neck. Just enough to draw attention, not to himself, but to what had been there all along, and in that single measured action, the room was forced to confront what it had chosen to ignore. There were no gasps, no outbursts, only a deep collective stillness as the reality of the situation crystallized in the minds of those present, because it is one thing to hear about injustice, to debate it, to distance oneself from it through language and denial, but it is another thing entirely to see it, undeniable and present, standing in front of you with no room left for interpretation. Dutch exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed not on Bumpy, but on the officials whose authority now seemed fragile, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to uncertainty. And in that moment, he understood something that had perhaps eluded him before, that true power was not about control, but about clarity, about the ability to bring truth into the open without force, without spectacle, and allow it to speak for itself. The shift in the room was subtle but profound, as the energy that had once supported the official's narrative began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable recognition. And one by one, people who had remained silent found themselves unable to maintain that silence any longer, not because they were compelled to speak, but because the truth had made silence feel heavier than words. Mrs. Ellington stepped forward slightly, her voice steady despite the emotion that lingered beneath it, recounting what she had seen with a clarity that left no room for dismissal. And others followed, not in a rush, not in chaos, but in a measured unfolding that felt less like confrontation and more like revelation, as if the truth had been waiting patiently for this exact moment to be acknowledged. The officials, once so certain, now stood at the center of a reality they could no longer reshape, their attempts to respond faltering under the weight of what had been revealed. And though no accusations were shouted, no demands made, the expectation in the room was clear. Accountability was no longer optional. Bumpy stepped back then, his role in the moment complete, not seeking recognition, not claiming victory, because he had never been interested in either. His purpose had been to restore balance, to ensure that what was rightfully seen would remain seen. And as he returned to his place, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had built over days finally finding release, not in noise but in understanding. Lila May stood a little taller now, not because her pain had disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged, because the weight she had been forced to carry alone was now shared, and in that sharing, something fundamental had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the moment. Dutch watched Bumpy for a long moment, a quiet respect settling in his expression, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And as the officials, now stripped of their certainty, began the slow, reluctant process of correcting what had been denied, it became clear that this was not simply the end of an incident, it was the beginning of something larger, Because in Harlem, truth does not just resolve, it echoes, it reshapes. It reminds people of who they are capable of being when they choose courage over convenience. And as the night carried on, no longer heavy with tension, but grounded in something steadier, something more honest, one thing became certain to all who had witnessed it: silence had lost its power, and dignity had found its voice again. The days that followed did not erupt into celebration, nor did Harlem suddenly transform into a place untouched by injustice, because truth, even when revealed, does not erase the weight of what came before it. But something had undeniably shifted beneath the surface, something quiet yet unshakable, like the slow turning of a tide that no one could stop once it had begun. And as people moved through their routines, opening shops, sweeping stoops, pouring coffee in familiar cafes, there was a difference in the way they carried themselves, a subtle lift in their posture, a steadiness in their gaze, because they had witnessed something rare: dignity not just offended, but restored without violence, without chaos, through nothing more than clarity and courage. Leila Mae Carter, who had once walked those same streets with her head lowered beneath the weight of doubt placed upon her, now moved with a quiet strength that did not demand attention but commanded respect. And though the marks on her neck would fade with time, the memory of what they represented would not. Yet for the first time since that night, those marks no longer defined her, they testified for her. And in the presence of those who had once questioned her, she no longer needed to explain herself, because the truth had already done that work. The Grand Lenox Ballroom, once a place of polished illusions, found itself changed in ways that could not be repaired with fresh paint or louder music, because those who entered its doors now carried with them the memory of what had been exposed within its walls, and the officials who had once stood with unshaken authority now moved more carefully, their voices measured, their decisions weighed not just against convenience, but against the awareness that they were being watched not with suspicion, but with expectation, the kind that leaves little room for the quiet dismissal of what is right. Bumpy Johnson, as always, did not linger in the spotlight of what he had set into motion, because he had never been interested in recognition. And in the days after, he returned to his routines with the same calm precision, sitting in familiar corners, listening more than he spoke, his presence steady and unchanged. Yet those who passed by him now did so with a deeper understanding, because they had seen what that quiet presence was capable of, not in force, but in influence, not in dominance, but in direction. Dutch Schultz remained in Harlem longer than expected, his usual detachment replaced by something more reflective, as if the events he had witnessed had unsettled not his power, but his perspective. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the street, he found Bumpy once again seated by a window, the soft clink of a coffee cup marking the passage of time between them. And for a while, neither spoke, because some moments do not require words, they require understanding. "You could have handled it differently," Dutch said at last, his tone thoughtful rather than critical, his gaze steady. Bumpy did not look up immediately, his fingers resting lightly against the cup as he considered the statement, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. "There are many ways to handle things," he replied calmly. Dutch nodded slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Most of them louder." "Louder doesn't mean clearer," Bumpy said, meeting his gaze now, his expression as composed as ever. There was a pause, the kind that carries more meaning than conversation, and in that pause, Dutch seemed to arrive at something unspoken, something that shifted the way he viewed not just Bumpy, but the nature of power itself, because what he had witnessed was not control enforced, but respect earned, not fear imposed, but truth revealed, and that difference, though subtle, carried a weight far greater than any display of force. As the days turned into weeks, the story of what had happened spread beyond Harlem, not as rumor or exaggeration, but as something closer to legend, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was rare, because it reminded people that justice did not always arrive with noise and confrontation. that sometimes it came quietly, through the steady insistence that what is right be seen and acknowledged, and in that way, it reached those who needed to hear it most, those who had grown accustomed to silence as a form of survival. Yet what made this story endure was not just the moment in the ballroom, not just the exposure of truth, but what followed, the way people chose to carry it forward, the way they spoke a little more carefully when dismissing others, the way they listened a little more closely when someone tried to speak, because once you have seen the cost of ignoring truth, it becomes harder to justify doing so again. Layla May, in time, found her place, not just as someone who had endured, but as someone who reminded others, through her presence alone, that being heard was not a privilege granted by others, but a right that could not be taken without consequence. And though she never sought attention, her story moved quietly through conversations, encouraging those who had once remained silent to reconsider what their silence allowed. Bumpy watched all of this without comment, as he always did, because he understood that the true measure of what had happened was not in the moment itself, but in what it changed afterward. And what it changed was not just a narrative, but a mindset, a willingness to see, to acknowledge, to act when necessary, and to trust that dignity, once defended, has a way of reinforcing itself. One evening, as Harlem settled into its familiar rhythm, the hum of life steady and enduring, Bumpy stepped out onto the street, pausing briefly as he looked down the block where people moved with purpose, with quiet confidence, and though nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary, there was something different in the air, something lighter, something more certain, as if the neighborhood itself had remembered something it had nearly forgotten, that even in the face of injustice, it still had the power to stand, to witness, and to choose what was right. He adjusted his coat slightly, his expression unchanged, and began to walk, his steps unhurried, blending once more into the rhythm of the city, because his work had never been about standing apart. It had always been about ensuring that others could stand without fear, and as he disappeared into the evening, the story he left behind did not fade. It settled, it rooted itself, it became part of Harlem's living memory. And in that memory, carried forward in quiet conversations and knowing glances, one truth remained clear above all others: real power is not in raising your voice, but in making the truth impossible to ignore.